Welcome to a place where love isn't loud, it's felt, where time doesn't steal connection, it reveals it. Here we don't chase fairy tales, we tell the quiet stories, the ones that begin with stillness, not sparks. Stories where age doesn't define love, energy does, where a glance holds more than words, and silence becomes home, where resistance isn't rejection, it's fear healing slowly, and when the soul recognizes its mirror, all the years in between disappear. If you've ever loved after loss, if you felt seen by someone you never expected, if your heart stirred not for passion, but for peace, then you belong here. These aren't stories about falling in love. They're about remembering it. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because somewhere in these stories, your soul might feel less alone. Time buried desire under silence until presence brought it back to life. I used to believe that parts of me had simply closed for good. Not bitterly, not with any drama. Just quietly, like an old door in a house no one walks through anymore. You don't slam it shut. You don't even lock it. It just stops being used, and over time dust settles, light stops spilling in, and the air becomes still. That's how it felt inside me, not dead, but untouched. For 12 years, I moved through life with grace and practicality. I smiled when I needed to, gave kindness where I could, and stayed out of the way of anything too bright, too loud, too warm. It was easier that way, simpler, and I told myself that simplicity was peace. But deep down, I knew the difference. There's a kind of peace that comes from healing, and there's a kind that comes from giving up quietly. I had made my home in the second kind. The days were soft, predictable, and my heart beat slow, like it was tired of remembering how much it had once loved. Then he started showing up, not with force, not with intent, not even with awareness, I think. He was just around, the boy next door, though boy hardly seemed the word. He was a man in every visible weight, all confident in that raw, unpolished way youth sometimes carries. But what struck me wasn't any of that. It was his calm. He spoke like the world wasn't racing, like there was time to breathe between words. He laughed with his eyes before his mouth moved, and he lingered on porches, near fences, at the garden's edge, as if he had nowhere more important to be. At first, I smiled out of politeness, a nod here, a wave there. I stayed within my walls, figuratively and literally, but something in his presence softened things that had long been rigid. He never asked for anything. Never pushed, just stayed. One evening, I was planting late into twilight. The soil was warm between my fingers, and I was lost in the rhythm of it when his voice, low and curious, asked me about the roses. Not because he wanted advice, not to impress, just to understand. That moment did something strange to my chest. It had been so long since anyone had asked me about something I loved. We started talking more after that. Simple things. Weather, books, food. He listened without interrupting, and when he spoke, it wasn't just to respond. It was to connect. I noticed the way he noticed, the way his eyes lingered just a moment longer than necessary, not in hunger, but in presence. As if he saw me before I had the chance to disappear. There was a night, maybe 2 months later, when I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, my tea had gone cold, and the ache of old memories sat heavy in my throat. I stepped out onto the porch just for air, only to see him across the yard, doing the same. Our eyes met. No wave, no smile, just stillness, and somehow that stillness said everything. He walked over slowly, hands tucked in his pockets like he was afraid to disturb the air between us. And we sat, no words, just the sound of crickets, the moonlight touching the tops of our feet, and a closeness that didn't feel wrong. Something in me stirred that night, not lust, not fantasy, something older, quieter, the need to be held in someone's gaze and not vanish, the need to matter without having to perform or pretend. I felt it rise uninvited, like a breath I hadn't taken in years, and I hated how much I wanted to stay in that moment. Because wanting felt dangerous, so I pulled back. The next few days I was colder, shorter. I made excuses not to be around, told myself stories about age and distance and dignity, but none of them quieted the ache in my chest. He noticed, of course, he always noticed, and instead of pressing in, he simply gave space. He never acted entitled to my time or my affection, but when our paths crossed, his eyes still held that same steady softness, that quiet message, "I see you. I'm not going anywhere." Eventually, the silence between us stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like loss. I missed his presence, missed the way the garden felt when he leaned near it, missed the way my voice sounded when he made me laugh. It wasn't that he made me feel young again. It was that he made me feel present, alive in a way that had nothing to do with age or time. I started noticing color again, noticing music, noticing my own breath, and that scared me more than anything, because when something awakens you, it also makes you realize how deeply asleep you've been. I tried to resist, truly, I did. Out of fear, out of guilt, out of some warped sense of what I was supposed to be, but the soul doesn't care about rules. It listens to energy, to truth, and in his quiet, unwavering way, he had spoken to the part of me I had long buried. One afternoon, after weeks of carefully crafted distance, I walked into the yard and found him tending to the herbs near the back gate. He looked up, surprised to see me. I didn't speak. I just sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, close enough to let the silence speak for me. He didn't ask why I'd come. He just offered me a small bunch of lavender, freshly picked and still fragrant, and in that moment, everything inside me softened. Not because of the gesture, but because I finally stopped pretending I didn't feel what I felt, and for the first time in 12 years, I let myself be fully seen, fully held, fully alive. That was the moment I knew. My soul already had. Connection doesn't care about years, it listens to energy, to truth. It's a strange thing, how a person can walk into your world without fanfare, and yet everything quietly rearranges itself around them. Not because of what they say or do, but because of how their presence feels. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He didn't approach with big words or practice charm. He just existed near me with a kind of ease that asked for nothing. But that's what made me notice, not because he needed attention, but because he didn't. There was something grounding in that, something real. I've known many people who speak too loudly, who try too hard to fill the air between them and others. But he was different. He left space, comfortable space, and when he looked at me, it was like the years between us never spoke. Only the moment did. At first, I told myself the same things anyone would. It's just kindness, he's young, this isn't anything. But over time, the silence between us stopped feeling like distance. It started feeling like a language, a kind of quiet intimacy that didn't need to be named. A shared understanding that was never forced, only felt. There was a moment, so small, so ordinary, that still lives in me. We were sitting on the edge of the porch, dusk settling over the trees, a soft breeze moving the air between us. Neither of us was speaking. I was sipping tea. He was watching the sky, and without turning to me, he said, "This part of the day always feels the most honest." Just that. No explanation. No need for one. And I felt it too. There's something about that hour, when the light softens and the world begins to slow, that invites truth. That night, I looked at him not as someone young or someone different, but simply as someone present. And in that stillness, I felt more known than I had in years. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about possibility or expectation. It was about recognition. Somewhere in him, something spoke to something in me. Not loudly, not with lightning, but with the steady, quiet hum of connection, like two instruments in tune before they ever play a note. We didn't need to talk every day. We didn't need constant contact. But when we were near each other, there was a kind of awareness, a stillness that welcomed both of us. I began to notice the small things, the way he'd pause when I spoke, like he wanted to hear the spaces between my words. The way he never looked past me, never glanced at his phone, never filled silence with noise. When I spoke, he was all there, not just his attention, his energy, and I hadn't felt that in so long. Energy doesn't lie. It doesn't follow rules or roles. It doesn't care about birth dates or timelines. It just connects, and with him, something in me softened every time he was near. There was a morning we ran into each other at the edge of the woods behind the property. I was walking. He was sitting with his sketchpad, drawing the trees. We didn't plan it, but when our eyes met, we both smiled, as if we'd been waiting for that moment without realizing it. He stood up, brushed off the leaves from his jeans, and without saying much, walked beside me. We didn't speak for a while. The birds did, the wind did, our footsteps did, and then he said, "I think some people are just meant to meet again and again, even if they don't understand why." That line sank into me like a stone dropped in water. Because I felt it too, this sense that what was building between us didn't need a name. It wasn't fast or loud or demanding. It was steady, natural, honest. There's something about truth that doesn't have to shout. It just is. Over time, I began to feel the pull more clearly, not a pull of the body, though that was there too, but a pull of presence, a sense of being known, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with emotion. With energy, I remember the first time I caught myself missing him, not needing, not craving, just feeling the space where he should have been. It happened during the simplest thing, folding laundry. A quiet afternoon, and I realized I was hoping to hear his voice in the distance, hoping he might wander by, and the strange part was, I didn't judge myself for it. It felt natural, like missing sunlight during a cloudy day. Connection, real connection, doesn't arrive with permission slips. It just happens. It ignores expectations. It settles into the soul like it's always belonged there, and suddenly you're not thinking about what's appropriate or acceptable. You're just feeling what's true. And truth doesn't ask for approval. I knew what the world might say. I knew what I'd say if I were standing outside looking in. But when something is real, it doesn't beg for explanation. It just stays. It just feels. He never rushed me, never pushed me, but he never wavered either. He was constant, unshaken, and that, more than anything, told me this was something different, something honest. In his presence, I didn't feel older. I didn't feel less than. I didn't feel anything other than exactly who I was, and that after all the years, after all the loss, was the most extraordinary feeling of all. It wasn't an escape from life. It was life, fully felt, fully seen, fully alive, and it never needed to be explained. Resistance wasn't strength, it was fear dressed in dignity. It took me a long time to admit that. I told myself I was being wise, being careful, being composed. That keeping distance wasn't rejection but reason, that holding the line wasn't coldness but caution, and maybe for a while it was, but deep down it wasn't strength that held me back, it was fear. Fear wrapped in old pain, fear wearing the mask of maturity, fear hiding behind the careful words I used to excuse my silence, because letting him in meant tearing open something that had long been sealed. I'd lost before. I'd known what it meant to give everything, only to be left with echoes, to open wide and be met with silence. That kind of wound doesn't just close, it calcifies, and I wore that silence like armor. But he was patient, not pushy, never loud. He didn't chase, but he didn't disappear either. He just stayed, a presence, a calm, a steady warmth I tried not to lean into, but did anyway. Every time he looked at me, really looked, I felt it. The soft knock on a door I wasn't ready to open. I'd smile, I'd change the subject, I'd busy my hands or walk away, but his eyes stayed with me, not as pressure, as invitation. There were days I convinced myself I had it under control, that the butterflies were just a passing thing, that he was too young, that I was too old, that this was just a sweet friendship, nothing more. But the ache in my chest told a different story, and the ache wasn't lust. It was longing, longing to be seen, to be touched, yes, but more than that, to be understood, because he saw the parts of me I'd forgotten were still alive. It wasn't one moment that broke my resistance. It was many little moments that chipped away at my carefully built wall until the cracks began to whisper the truth. One of those moments came during a storm. Rain had been falling for hours, the kind of storm that makes the world feel hushed, sacred. I was staring out the window, watching the water slide down the glass, trying to find stillness inside myself. And then, without knocking, without needing to be announced, he came and stood behind me. No words, just presence. He didn't touch me. He didn't speak. He just stood close enough for me to feel his warmth, his breath. And I remember thinking, this is what it feels like to be safe again. I could have moved. I could have broken the silence, but I didn't. I let it wrap around us like a blanket. My pulse slowed, my breath deepened, and in that moment, something inside me said, "You don't have to fight this." But still I did. Later that week, when he reached out gently, asked if I was all right, I lied, said I was fine, said I'd just been tired. I saw the flicker of hurt in his eyes, quickly masked by a soft nod. He didn't argue, he never did, and that hurt more than if he had, because I knew I was pushing away something honest. Fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It tells you you're being reasonable when really you're just afraid of losing again, of hoping again, of loving again, and that fear wore me out. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, the house quiet, the sky outside thick with stars, and I just sat there, hand on my chest, wondering why I was still holding back. It wasn't pride, it wasn't age, it wasn't logic, it was grief, grief pretending to be control. And when that realization settled in me, I wept, not because I had been wrong to be careful, but because I had mistaken self-protection for wisdom. And I was so tired of resisting something that felt like peace. When you meet someone who doesn't ask you to perform, who doesn't need you to be anything but still and real, something in your soul recognizes it. And no matter how much your mind says don't, your heart aches in that person's absence. The next time I saw him, I didn't plan to say anything. I just needed to be near him again, just to feel what I hadn't allowed myself to feel. He was sitting on the edge of the garden bed, dirt on his hands, a gentle breeze tugging at his hair. He looked up and smiled, soft and quiet like always, and I swear the weight I'd been carrying began to slip. I sat beside him. We didn't talk for a while, just let the sun warm our shoulders and the silence settle. And then I reached over, not dramatically, not with grand gesture, and I took his hand. He looked at me, eyes searching. Not with urgency, but with something even deeper, understanding, and I said quietly, "I've been afraid." He didn't say, "Of what?" He just squeezed my hand and said, "I know. No demands, no expectations." Just that, and that's when the last of my resistance broke, because love doesn't always come in fire and noise. Sometimes it comes in stillness, in patience, in the gentle waiting that says, "I'll be here when you're ready." And when the soul recognizes its mirror, even the strongest walls begin to ache. Sometimes resistance isn't strength. Sometimes it's just the fear of being touched where we're still healing. But when the right hands reach out, not to fix you, not to save you, just to hold you, the fight inside quiets and you let go. Sometimes love doesn't begin with lightning. It starts with stillness. There wasn't a single moment I could point to where everything changed. No thunderclap, no sudden spark, just a quiet shift, like the way sunlight softens as the day fades, and you don't realize it's dusk until you notice the stillness around you. He was just there at first, by the garden fence, helping with small things, trimming the lavender, turning the soil. It was early spring. The air still held a chill, and the earth was beginning to breathe again. I watched him work from the window the first few times. His hands were careful, not clumsy, respectful, as if he understood the quiet of the soil and didn't want to disturb it. We didn't speak much in those days, a nod, a soft good morning, a passing smile. I told myself he was just being kind, helpful, a neighbor's grandson offering his time, that was all. But something in the air shifted the day he brought tea. I was sitting on the back step, watching the wind tease the daffodils that had begun to bloom. I heard the screen door creak, and there he was holding 2 cups. He didn't ask, just handed me one, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I took it without thinking, and our fingers touched for a second longer than necessary. It was warm jasmine. I hadn't mentioned it was my favorite. He didn't sit too close, just settled on the steps beside me, a respectful distance apart, and sipped. We didn't talk. There was no need. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt shared, like we were listening to the same thing. The breeze, the birds, the stillness between. I remember glancing at him then, not fully, just from the corner of my eye, and I felt it, not passion. Not desire, something quieter, something that stirred not in my body but in my soul, recognition. It was like standing in a place you've never been and feeling you've been there before. After that, he came by often. Not daily, just enough, a few afternoons each week. Sometimes he helped in the garden. Sometimes we sat in silence. Sometimes we shared tea and stories. Not of our lives, but of the small things, the weather, the shape of the clouds, a poem he liked, a book I'd once read, and through it all I felt it growing, not fast, not wild, but steady, like roots under soil, quiet and sure. It's strange how stillness can hold more than words ever could. How 2 people can sit side by side and say nothing, and yet speak volumes. There was a day the sky turned gold just before sunset. He stood by the garden fence, wiping his hands on his jeans, and looked up. I watched the light touch his face, and I felt something bloom inside me that had long been asleep. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about what should or shouldn't be. It was the way his presence didn't rush me. The way his energy didn't demand anything, just allowed me to exist, to breathe, to feel again, and I did feel again. I noticed things I'd stopped noticing. The way my hands reached for the teacup, steady. The way I listened more carefully. The way my heart softened when I heard his footsteps on the gravel. There was a morning he came to prune the rosemary. I'd been inside, wrapped in a book, but I heard him humming. A soft, unfamiliar tune. I opened the window to listen. The song was slow, unhurried, like the way he walked. I leaned into the frame, eyes closed, and let the sound wash over me. When I opened them, he was looking up at me. Not startled, just calm, he smiled, and something inside me said, "This is it, not lightning, not fire, just this, a shared breath, a moment of being seen without needing to be explained." After that day, I started watching for him more, listening for his voice, not because I wanted anything from him, but because when he was near, the world felt quieter and somehow fuller. One afternoon, we shared a blanket beneath the old willow. The breeze danced through the leaves, and the sun painted soft shadows across our skin. He told me a story from his childhood, something about climbing trees and scraped knees, and I laughed in a way I hadn't in years. Not polite laughter, not forced, just real. He turned to me, eyes wide with wonder, and said, "That sound, it suits you." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat tightened with something deeper than emotion. It was truth. He saw me, and not just the surface. He saw the quiet places I didn't show anyone, the places time had weathered and I thought no one would care to know. Still, we didn't name it. We didn't label what was happening. It wasn't necessary. The soul doesn't need definition. It just knows. Love didn't arrive in a rush. It arrived like spring after a long winter. Subtle, patient, gentle, it didn't demand to be felt. It invited me to remember I still could feel, and in that remembering I came back to life. When he reached for my hand one evening as we watched the moon rise, I didn't flinch. I didn't question. I just let our fingers intertwine, and I leaned into the quiet truth between us. This was home, not a place, not a person, a feeling, a presence, a stillness that spoke louder than any storm. Sometimes love doesn't begin with lightning. Sometimes it's the hush of two hearts breathing the same rhythm, and you know it's real, because even in silence you feel seen, if that story stirred something in you. If it made you remember, ache, or hope again. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who believes in quiet, real love, because here, love doesn't rush, it remembers.